All right, welcome to Health and Wellness with Coach A.T. Moore. Today we have a guest with us. We have Miss Chasity Williams LCSW-S. Welcome to the show, Miss Chasity.
Thank you.
S, I'm assuming, stands for supervisor?
It is a clinical supervisor, yes.
So Authentically You Counseling. I love the name of your practice. Is there a reason you selected this name for your practice?
Well, I actually went through a few different names, just kind of thinking about what I might want to go with. But I think the reason I chose that name mostly was because I think part of counseling, at least in my own personal experience, was that you want to go into a space, particularly with counseling, where you can be real with that person. You don't have to wear a mask. You can kind of come in and kind of put that mask on the table, so to speak, without having to feel like you need to put on a face for someone else, because we do that in our daily lives in different situations. So Authentically You, I think, just speaks to the person being able to come into this counseling space, this therapeutic space, and be authentically who they are, be authentically wherever they are at, emotionally, psychologically, wherever they're at in regards to their readiness for even the therapeutic process. So yeah, that's the reason I chose the name, because I feel like that's, a pretty authentic, reflection of kind of what I like to bring.
How long have you been in the field?
In the field of mental health, it's been maybe 10 years or so. The private practice piece, a bit less time actually.
So I want to go over the services that your practice provides. You have grief and bereavement counseling, life transitions, stress management, race-related stress and trauma, and survivors of victimization. Now, this race-related stress, I'm pretty sure that you have been inundated with services with all we've been through over the last couple of years. So for this particular interview, I kind of want to just kind of focus most of our questions there, and then hopefully we can have you back to talk about some of the other services that you provide. So when I was looking at your website and I was reading the About Me section, the About Chasity Williams section, I got this quote. It says, "My initial career plan did not include me being a therapist, but this career chose me." Can you share more about what your original plans were before you and how you ended up in the mental health field? Can you take us through that journey?
Initially, believe it or not, my initial plan was to be a sign language interpreter. Life happened and that didn't. That was my initial plan, and then it evolved into speech pathology. But interestingly enough, in college, part of the prerequisites to be in the program for speech pathology was to be able to pass physics. And of course, physics is related to math, and
They don't want
to do math. So that didn't happen. So I ended up doing social work. At that time, I had no idea what in the world social work even was. I thought it was just like CPS work, which was not anything I had any interest in. Did my research and kind of rolled with that, and that's where I ended up getting my master's in social work. Did some work in the emergency room. I did some work in with victim services, the Travis County Sheriff's Office. Counseling was not something I really thought much about. Ended up really kind of falling into that, realizing that I do enjoy kind of that back and forth, working with people on more of a longer term basis to kind of work with them and kind of partner with them to help them to figure out kind of where they want to be. One thing I do enjoy is kind of seeing that progress, seeing them have those breakthroughs, seeing them recognize or unlearn unhealthy thought patterns and things that maybe they were always brought up to think as normal, to finally realize, oh, wait a minute, I can write my own story. So those are some really great things that I kind of realized, you know what, I really enjoy this. So that's kind of how counseling chose me.
Do you work more with children or adults, male, females?
Only adults, 18 and up. Yeah, adults only, and actually individuals. I enjoy just kind of working directly with that person. Things can get a little bit complicated, if you will, when we incorporate like family counseling and maybe couples counseling. So for me personally, I really enjoy just that individual work with people.
In your opinion, what is one of, there are several, I think, but what do you think one of the biggest stereotypes or misconceptions about mental health and therapy?
I would say that definitely, for one, I think that you're crazy. Mm-hmm. There's that idea that something has to be wrong with you to need some sort of counseling or mental health care. Mm-hmm. I had a person that I know, actually a family member, that I had mentioned about some counseling, and they had some free counseling available through their employee assistance program. And the first thing he said was, "Why are you telling me about counseling? I don't need counseling." Because there's that idea that something has to be wrong.
Right.
When in actuality, it may not necessarily be. But I think that's definitely, one of the bigger ones. I think, people assume that they'll be forced to, take medication, and that's not true. So, so I think definitely there's quite a few stereotypes for sure. But, I think one of the things I do hear a lot is people that, maybe have some stigma, kind of that idea that maybe they're weak, or something's wrong with them because they can't manage their own life. And so I hear that quite often, that they kind of beat themselves up because they even feel like they have to go to counseling. So so there's quite a few things that as far as stereotypes go.
I have some friends that were looking for therapy, and what they found, what they said they were having trouble finding was someone that looked like them, a minority. And so that was one of the challenges that they had, just thinking that there's not a lot of, minorities in the mental health, profession. And we're here.
We are. And I think there has been an influx within the last several years, especially with the political climate and just race relations and everything else going on, pandemic, all that fun stuff we've been through. I think there's been an influx of not only people of color seeking mental health care, but also people of color going into the field. Yes. So just like you said, we're here because there are quite a few people out there, more than I even thought, that are available. And I think the great thing too, I think the one thing that the pandemic actually brought us is, the virtual world, being able to access telehealth services. And it's much more normalized and common now than it was maybe 2 or 3 years ago. So, that definitely broadens the connection to many people of color as far as counselors, especially if you live in an area where maybe it's not quite that diverse, or maybe that particular therapist that maybe is for you, because just because somebody looks like you don't mean they're for you. So if you do see that person, they can live in another city. So living in Austin, they can live in Dallas, and you can still see them weekly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm also seeing a lot of more male minorities in the mental health field, but I didn't know that as well. One of the stereotypes and misconceptions that I have been seeing, because I work more with young adults, teenagers, is when I'll have a parent that is talking to concerns about their child is going through some type of transition period. And when I bring up, well, have you considered, therapy? Because sometimes, a mental health professional can help them frame stuff and have conversations that they might not feel comfortable having with a parent. And trying to get parents to see, just because your child is in therapy doesn't mean there's anything wrong with them, or there's anything wrong with you as a parent. You're not a bad parent because your child is in therapy. Actually, it could be the opposite. You're a good parent, and you want to make sure that their mental health is taken care of. So that's another stereotype that I see a lot.
Yeah, and with the parenting piece, I think too, that idea that how dare they talk to some other adult? They can talk to me. They don't need to talk to someone else, when that's not the case. And that's the case also can be the same for spouses and friends and just adults in general, is having that safe space to kind of process things as you need it with
Right.
someone that's not directly involved in your day-to-day or your family life or things like that.
Yeah, not venting to friends and family. Yeah. So your title is a trauma-informed licensed therapist. Can you kind of break down what that means when you talk about trauma-informed?
So trauma-informed basically is someone that has knowledge and or training related to trauma and how it impacts a person, just holistically, how it impacts every facet of their being, pretty much. Long-term, short-term impacts of trauma. Ultimately, that's kind of what that means, is someone that understands. So, rather than focusing on, the what's wrong with you aspects, it's more of what happened to you.
What are 5 things that you think people should know about trauma?
There's 50 things, but we will stick with 5. Trauma doesn't discriminate. So, trauma impacts everybody and their mama. So, it doesn't matter where you come from, who you are, what you look like. It can impact everyone. One of those things too, I think, that's defined by the person. So, and what I mean by that is, if two people may experience the same event, and one person may really have a negative reaction to whatever it was, and the other person may be just fine. Right. No one else can tell you no one else can define trauma, basically, for you. So, if someone had went through a violent crime, maybe they experienced a violent crime, or a loved one, was injured or hurt or killed or whatever the case may be, they're the ones that define what that trauma means to them. So that's definitely another one. It really impacts every kind of layer of who you are. It impacts every relationship, be it romantic relationship, friendships, family relationships, relationships with children, all those various things. It creeps into all of that. Yeah. And impacts your interactions with even coworkers. See, another thing, triggers. Triggers are basically things that kind of take you back to that moment. So if you've experienced a traumatic situation or incident, triggers can definitely take you back to that moment. I always say triggers kind of hone in on your 5 senses. So all your 5 senses can be impacted, and triggers are very real, and they definitely can make you feel like the trauma is happening all over again right at that moment. The other thing is, just understanding that there's healing and help out there. I think sometimes if a person has dealt with trauma, whether it be one catastrophic thing or numerous smaller things, there can be this sense of hopelessness and helplessness. And so I think realizing that the trauma doesn't have to defeat you, that there is, healing and help out there.
My background is education. I spent about 20 years working in secondary education, did some middle school. And I remember during professional development in the summer, we had some mental health professionals come in, and it's the first time that we had ever had a professional development around trauma. And I remember I had an aha moment when they were saying that trauma is not something that, it's not just something that you yourself have to experience. It could be something that you witnessed. And so that kind of blew my mind, because I had students in my class that had witnessed some really horrific, violent crimes, and had lived in neighborhoods where they had seen and just been a part of. And I heard that, growing up with in poverty can also be trauma. And so you learn these things, because when I used to think of trauma before I went into the mental health field, I just thought it was just one thing. Something happens to you but it could be something that you experienced, something you've lived through. It could be a lack of resources. And so that just kind of really gave me more of a broader view of trauma.
And I think, something you've witnessed for sure. And I think, secondary trauma is a huge one that a lot of times doesn't get the attention that it deserves. Because secondary trauma can be something that maybe it didn't impact you directly, but it can still have the same impact. So, for example, a friend that maybe was raped, for example, and they're telling you, hey, this is what happened to me, and they're sharing their story. So even though it didn't happen to you, now you're traumatized because you heard their story. Another thing I always tell people, especially if they're dealing with acute trauma, is watching your social media, watching how much you are exposed to in not only the news media, but also social media, because lots of different news stories and postings and different things like that, that can be secondary trauma. When you hear about this horrific thing that happened on the news, right, that can be very traumatizing for people, and you can still have some of those same reactions and impact can still impact you, the same as it would someone who may have actually witnessed those things.
For me, I didn't have a name for it, but I know that when we have these movies that talk about these horrific crimes that happened a long time ago and they make movies about it, it's traumatizing for me. I can't sleep. I replay stuff. It makes me think. Mm-hmm. And some people can watch that stuff. My husband can watch that stuff and he can be fine with it. Well, me, I will stay up. I will start just ruminating about what happened in the past. And so I have to be very careful. I just can't see every slave movie that comes out. I can't see every movie that comes out about our history or anyone's, history, because it affects me differently on a different level.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's a lot of great documentaries out there, but you got to pick and choose and be careful.
So you mentioned that, trauma affects relationships because it can affect how you connect. You can not connect with someone because of something that you experienced, in your past. So how can trauma affect our health?
In regards to health, obviously mental health, because mental health and physical health are one and the same sometimes, but they're just as important. But as far as physical health goes, one thing about trauma, it can impact your physical pain. Sometimes people may experience physical pain, fatigue. It can also create chronic health issues like high blood pressure. I've known of some people that may later in life develop different types of cancers. It can also impact your brain development, especially depending on the trauma especially with kids. When it happens at a young age, it can definitely impact the person's brain development. And it can impact the brain wiring. Even as an adult going through trauma, it can impact the brain wiring.
I know when you grow up with, elders, older people, they really didn't have access to mental health like we do now. And so a lot of the things that kids might have experienced, the response might have been, they too young to remember that, or that can affect them. So is there an age limit or time frame for trauma? Can a person be too young to experience trauma or too old? And is there a length of time that trauma can exist?
As far as too young or too old, absolutely not. There's been studies that show even infants can experience trauma, especially if they're in a violent household, if there's domestic violence or things like that in their household. It here again can impact their development, even though they may not be able to verbalize or remember what happened. It can still impact even children. There's no age, as far as no one's too young, and no one's too old. So yeah, it's, as I said before, it does not discriminate, and it doesn't matter any age. And as far as a timeline, trauma can, it kind of unfortunately becomes a part of you. So it doesn't just disappear. It doesn't just disappear. Now it can be treated, and there's help out there and healing out there. You can learn certain ways of coping in a healthy way to manage your symptoms, to have a good quality of life.
Right.
But as far as the trauma, it doesn't just go away. So, I've known people that their trauma happened 30 years ago and they still get triggered, or they may still have nightmares, or, there may be certain times of the year that are really difficult for them because maybe that was the time of the year that the trauma happened. So, it really doesn't matter as far as how much time has passed,
Right.
Because your brain and your body remembers all these things.
I hope you've enjoyed part 1 of our interview with Miss Chasity Williams. Make sure you stick around for part 2, where we continue to talk about trauma, but we also talk about self-care and soul care, because there is a difference. This is Health and Wellness with Coach A.T. Moore. Thanks for watching.